course, there's quite a bit here that I am not talking about, and parts of Ecclesiastes that I will be ignoring because I'd be making endless videos on them. So you need to read it for yourself and sort of decide what sort of text it is and what sort of ethical text it is and what it is actually saying about us as human beings and what sort of ethical advice it's giving us. It is quite a remarkable text. In chapter, I wanted to just say a few things about the kind of things that are said in chapter 5, where you have this change of tone and change of the kind of text it is. It may seem very abrupt, but we have to always keep in mind is that we're dealing with an ancient text. A text from Ecclesiastes is at least 2,000 years old and probably 2,000 plus years old. So we don't know who wrote it, really, and we don't know how many people had a hand in writing it. Ancient texts are oftentimes combinations of several texts, and there's the work of several hands, and there is editing going on here. So the reason I say that is because what you get in the beginning of chapter 5 is several verses which are proverbs or sayings or saws or adages, these pithy little bits of ethical advice which are typical of the Bible and typical of the ancient world and typical of folk cultures, typical of folk traditions within cultures. It's like when in Hamlet, when Laertes' father, Polonius, is seeing him off when he goes to, I guess, to study in Paris. He gives him all these ethical advice, and it's just a collection of things like this, like be neither a borrower nor a lender be, stuff like that. Which is not to disparage these things, but it's just a kind of typically how ethical advice is given in older civilizations, older cultures. Not that it's easy to understand what's being said, but rather than a sort of an ethical discourse in which themes are gradually and systematically developed, you get these pithy little sayings. Keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God. Now, what keep thy foot means, you'll have to ask somebody in 1610. Keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. That's kind of, I'm not sure. That's kind of like, you have to really think about what that means. There is that general, be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools. Be humble, listen, especially when you're in the house of God. Do not be rash with thy mouth, says verse 2, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. Be careful. Don't talk too much. For instance, when in verse 4 here, when thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldst not vow than that thou shouldst vow and not pay. If you make a promise to God, you should pay it right away. Better not to make any promises than to make a promise and not pay it, which is probably good advice whether you're talking to God or anyone else. And then, some proverbs or saws or adages here that are really kind of ambiguous and not really clear what's being said, or that, like look at verse 8. If thou seest the oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter. For he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. If you see that there's a part of the world in which people are mistreated, and there's injustice and perversion of judgment, don't be surprised. And keep in mind that whoever's in charge knows this, which is really interesting. I don't know if modern times would really agree with something like that. So we'll see these kind of ethical little pithy little pieces of advice over and over again in Ecclesiastes, and if you look at the other wisdom books, or you look at especially Proverbs, these pithy little pieces of ethical advice are really kind of what a lot of ancient cultures, what their ethical teaching, the form that it took, which is, I think, quite interesting.